Well, good morning, Laura. I hope you're doing well. Today I'd like to explore a rather simple question. To what extent do economic factors influence voting behaviour? But before we get started, I'd like to point out the ambiguity that this question offers. Is it referring to the economic situation of the voter, the economic situation of the country, or the perceived attitude of the political parties towards the economy? It's not clear. However, I think that all three of these play a role in the answer, and today we'll look at all of them as I show that economic factors influence voting behaviour as far as they are one issue that the electorate cares about. I'd also like to apologise for my focus on British politics. I'm sure by now you're sick of home students only ever analysing UK politics, while it's all the internationals who branch out into more fun countries and case studies. But what can I say? We're close-minded. So in the lecture on the topic of voting behaviour, Justin touches on 4 basic models for analysis. I'd like to go into all 4 of these, finishing with valence models, and then we'll have a look at how the economy plays out as one factor of competence. The first of these models is the sociological one. Voting is a product of the social situation of the voter. This is where class voting comes in. It was the case in the 1950s and 60s that if you were working class, you voted Labour, and if you were middle class, you voted Conservative. But this really isn't the case nowadays at all. Brexit in 2016 was a predominantly right-wing policy voted for by the working class. So while class voting worked as a concept in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Alford Index scored us in 2010 a measly 17 compared to 43 50 years earlier. So if economic factors do play a role, it's not just based on voters' income and positions in society. Another factor within this model is religion, particularly in the American pressure groups. As someone who firstly is religious and secondly went to a school where about 60% of pupils were American evangelicals, I find this fascinating. The evangelical right in America holds huge political influence, and certain views are seen to come with the faith, views that I as a British evangelical don't necessarily agree with. And those aren't driven by the economy. Those voters believe them to be morally right. So the economy clearly isn't everything when it comes to voting. But if we now move away from the sociological model to psychological model and the Michigan scale, in 1960, Donald Stokes, amongst others, published their study called The American Voter. This argued that party support is more determined by party socialization than by ideology per se. And if this is the case, it would also point away from economic factors being important really at all. People would vote for the side that they most identified with. But we've already talked about this great class de-alignment that happened between the 1960s and the 1990s. Anthony McGann takes issue with this Michigan scale in his 2009 paper, arguing that while people do form party alliances, they also exhibit secondary attachments to others, which are then often overlooked in political analyses. Ultimately, however, this is just too narrow of an explanation to be viable now. It's worth mentioning though, especially since it was published in a time when the move was towards deterministic theories, and this is an area that is especially true in rational choice. So the rational choice approach. Humans vote selfishly for what they'll do, for how they'll best maximise their own good, and parties seek to maximise votes before an election, so try to discover what people want. Now, I'm sure you can guess what's coming next. In 1957, Downes published his now contentious article, An Economic Theory of Democracy, in which he outlined his median voter theorem. This says that a voter's preferences are fixed and that parties move along the political spectrum searching for votes. Because of this, they'll ultimately converge in the middle because that's the best way to get as many votes as possible. So, let's look at But when it comes to economic factors influencing voting, the median voter theorem would essentially say they don't matter at all. Parties just try to discover what voters think about this. But this model's pretty rubbish. Downes himself in the exact same article then goes on to admit that voters can be persuaded. In a 2011 paper though, Sanders doesn't completely dismiss this spatial model. He uses British election study data from between 2005 to 2009 to conclude that they are actually useful when it comes to showing that when an individual is close to a political party on the spectrum, he's more likely to see that party as competent. And when it comes to the issues of competence, there's no other model to go to than valence models. So these basically argue that what actually matters when it comes to votes is perceived competence. In a 2008 paper, Green highlights the concept of issue voting, which is when voters place their votes based on which party they perceive to care more about a chosen issue. She reckons that since 1997, parties have converged on the middle, as Downs proposed that they would, and so leader and party competence on issues mattering to the electorate are now more important than traditionally discussed policy areas. And I'd maintain that the economy is quite simply just one of these areas that the electorate cares about and looks for competence in. So now we come to the crux of the issue. Sanders, in his 1999 paper, looks at the drop in perceived economic competence of the Conservatives, as well as the Labour Party leader election of Blair, and points to certain events as widely impacting perceptions on both parties. This backs up this idea of valence models. He argues that voters' perceptions of the economy played a less significant role in 1992 and 1997 than previously. And you might think, but hold on, the ERM crisis of 1992 was all about the economy. And you'd be right. It was also a significant contributing factor to a Conservative defeat in 1997. So how can this be? Well, the answer lies in the fact that the ERM fiasco is fundamentally a crisis. It didn't matter that it happened to the economy. Let me explain. When the electorate saw what happened, they didn't jump into analyses of fiscal monetary policy because the majority of the electorate don't have degrees in macroeconomics. Instead, they looked at how their leaders dealt with what they perceived to be a big issue. And when there's a big event or crisis, this allows the politics of parties debating to influence voter choice more. It wouldn't have mattered if that crisis in 1992 had been about horse meat being passed off as beef. What matters is that it was a challenge the leaders had to overcome. And subsequently, New Labour took the 1997 election by storm. In all this talk of competence, though, I'm not suggesting that the economy doesn't still play a significant role. In a later article, Sanders again argues that there are three areas parties must convince the electorate that they're competent in: public services, public safety, and the economy. And between 1994 and 1997, Andrew Hindmore tells us that New Labour changed three key policies, one of which was that they would not hike income tax. This points clearly to individual economic factors still being significant in who people choose to vote for. And so before I close, I want to finish with this quote from Johnston and Patty's 2011 paper analysing Labour's 2010 defeat. Elections are won and lost on the perceived competence of the parties and their leaders. This is to say, parties can do all they like to improve the economy and keep unemployment rates down, maintain high interest while keeping a lid on inflation, but if the electorate doesn't perceive them to be doing a good job, it's all for nothing. So in conclusion, economic factors do influence election outcomes, but they're not the be-all and the end-all. They are one major issue that tests the competence of parties. Nothing more, nothing less. Thank you for your time.